chapter 8 and 9. We get these couple interesting paragraphs in chapter 8 where the emperor is kind of reviewing the troops again, and we just see, especially in Nikolai, how he loses his sense of self to the greater cause of the Russian society, all funneled through the emperor. And this can be both for good and for bad purpose. I'll just read a little bit here. Every soldier and general felt his own insignificance, was conscious of being a grain of sand in that sea of men, and at the same time felt his own might, being conscious of himself as part of that great whole. And then a bit later, Rostov experienced the same feeling as every other man in the army, a feeling of self-oblivion, a proud consciousness of might, and a passionate devotion to him who was the cause of that triumphant occasion. And that's speaking of the emperor. And so there's this real sense, the wording there, self-oblivion and a proud consciousness of might. This is a very powerful emotional experience to have. Rostov, too, bending over his saddle, shouted with all his might, wishing he might injure himself with that cry, hurrah, if only to give full expression of his rapture. And it's interesting, in this state, there's a little paragraph, he's wondering about Andrei again, and how he was kind of pissed off at Andrei and in conflict with him, but at the same time admired him, and maybe more dissatisfied with himself in some unconscious way. And he's wondering about this conflict he has with Andrei, at least as is perceived by him. And it says, is it even worth thinking or speaking of it at such a moment, at such a time of love, rapture, and self-sacrifice? What do any of our quarrels and insults matter? I love and forgive everyone now. And so here's an example of this moment of rapture, of being part of the army, of the emperor coming by. It's serving to set his whole mind in a different light. You know, in that moment when he's interacting with Andrei and Andrei leaves, he's just beside himself, thinking of what he should say, should he confront Andrei? And this consumed him. This, there was no swerving him or telling him, hey, chill, man, don't be like that. And yet here's an emotional moment that completely and seamlessly just totally turned the dial down on all that. And so I find this capacity in humans to be completely fascinating. Just when we think there's nothing but this and something external to us, or in this case, it is very much a reduction of our sense of self-importance, him being part of this grand unifying thing. It's not that he was a nothing, but he felt his connection and his unity with this greater purpose, that these sort of petty quarrels and conflicts in his mind, just the dial really got turned down. So I kind of really like that, as illustrated in Nikolai, who a moment later was sort of being described as being childish. And now here, I love and forgive everyone now, just like that. This is not a voluntary figuring it out. Oh yeah, this makes sense. It's this very much an emotional triggered. And then we see Boris in chapter 9 getting help with Andrei, and we see a few interesting things here. And Boris comes, and Andrei's talking to the general, and Andrei sees Boris, and it's kind of like, oh, hey, and he right away he just kind of leaves the general and comes to Boris, and Boris is kind of surprised by this, but it's kind of like, here's the general. Aren't we all just supposed to be there's this order of stature, so to speak. At that moment, Borley clearly realized what he had before surmised, which was that in the army, apart from the subordination and discipline prescribed by the regulations, in which he and everyone else in the regiment knew, there was another, more fundamental subordination, which made this purple-faced general wait respectfully, while Captain Prince Andrei found it more convenient to chat with Lieutenant Drubetskoy for his own pleasure. And so what this triggered in my mind is comparing and contrasting Andrei with Pierre. Andrei is a much, what is it we wish Pierre was? We wish he was more self-confident, or had to have people around him instead of manipulating him to boosting his confidence. And so we criticize maybe Pierre for this sort of being too, he's very kind-hearted, but it's to a fault, And then in Andrei, what's our criticism of Andrei? Well, our criticism of Andrei is almost that he is too self-confident and he is too sort of independent and separate in his ideas and disdainful of others, to the point of being disdainful of others. But this is the very thing we wish Pierre would have more of. And so it's kind of the very thing that you are kind of admired for can be your very Achilles heel as well. It can be your very fault. And I find this very common in people. What is a strength is also a weakness. And it's just really kind of a fine line. And I just found that interesting now, how confident and sort of at ease with himself that in the presence of this general, he could just almost matter-of-factly just, I'm going to ignore you, General, for a bit. I'm going to go talk to Boris. And then here's the kind of the core of this whole couple chapters. There's this war council going on. So the Russian armies have been united. And they're in this heightened sense of success. They've had these small victories against the French, and they're, as a whole, the morale is high, and they're thinking really positive of themselves. And so at the council, contravening the advice of the old generals Kutuzov and Schwarzenberg, contravening the advice of the old generals. So who's Kutuzov? Kutuzov, he's like the king of the generals kind of thing. And we've seen him and seen his Bagration, the person under Kutuzov. We've seen their behavior, and contravening the advice of the old generals Kutuzov. That's what I want to put an asterisk by. It had been decided to advance without delay and give battle to Bonaparte. The Council of War had only just ended when Prince Andrei and Boris arrived at the palace. Everyone at the headquarters was still under the spell of victory, under the spell. And so, what Nikolai, just a few paragraphs before, he's under the spell of this unifying, being part of this greater thing, and it just leads him to love and forgive everyone. What's the whole state of the army right now? They're under the spell of victory. Kutuzov isn't. Kutuzov isn't under this spell. So he's saying something opposite. The voices of those who counseled delay, like Kutuzov, and advised waiting for one reason or other before advancing, had been silenced with such unanimity, and their arguments refuted with such conclusive proof of the advantages of an attack, that what had been discussed in the council, the coming battle and certain victory, no longer seemed to be in the future, but in the past. All the advantages were on our side. Our enormous forces, undoubtedly superior to Napoleon's. The troops, inspired by the presence of the emperor, and were eager for action. The strategic point where the action would take place was known in detail. And also, by fortunate coincidence, the Austrian army had held maneuvers the preceding year on the very fields where now the French were to be fought. So there was kind of a knowledge advantage of the terrain. And so all these things, there's just, again, just like a few chapters, just a few sentences earlier, we read about how the soldiers felt. Let me read that again. Every general and soldier felt his own insignificance, was conscious of being a grain of sand in that sea of men, and at the same time, felt his own might, being conscious of himself as part of this great whole. And so there's this kind of a dichotomy of you kind of lose yourself in this greater whole, and you yourself become more confident. And this is what's happening with everyone as part of the army. For some reason, Kutuzov stands apart. He's not caught up by this spell of victory. And it's further underlined, we see when Prince Andrei finally reaches Dolgorukov, who he's trying to get with Boris. This is the interaction here. I have been unjust to the Austrians, and especially Weyrother. What meticulous precision, what a knowledge of the terrain, what foresight for every eventuality, for every condition, down to the minutest detail. No, my dear fellow, it would be impossible to devise a more advantageous circumstance than those we are in now. A combination of the Austrian precision and the Russian valor. What more could you want? It's just like this is a slam dunk. And of course, it's almost foreshadowing of something's going to go off the rails. There's like too much confidence here. It's like we know too much for our own good. And I don't know, there's kind of like a warning bell ringing in my head. And then there's this, just a kind of bookend, there's this one paragraph that Boris, speaking about Boris, the idea of being so close to the higher powers as he felt himself to be at that moment was very thrilling to Boris. He was conscious of being where he was, in contact with the springs that set in motion all the colossal movements of that mass of which he and his regiment felt himself a small, humble, insignificant part. And it almost feels like everybody is sort of in a similar boat. Certainly Kutuzov feels that. Some of these other generals who are just overconfident and caught up with the spell, you get the sense that maybe they feel they're the ones at the levers pulling these controls and governing the forces, but it's it's a spell of which they are under. They think they are planning this wise, meticulous, successful thing with all these good reasons, on and on and on and on and on. But there's also this other undercurrent where we kind of get a feel things are just, even the generals themselves are just being carried along. And I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting little dichotomy between these things. And so, and again, I just want to just highlight and underline, the thing we kind of wish Pierre had more of. Prince Andrei has a lot of it, and it's almost like he should give some of that to Pierre. It's kind of like somehow the good, kind-hearted nature of Pierre is preventing, well, this is a simplistic answer, but he's lacking in self-confidence while at the same time being very empathetic. Prince Andrei, he's growing in self-confidence and composure. You see how he was with Nicholas. You wonder if Kutuzov is rubbing off on him a bit. And you only wish he could have more of Pierre's sort of kind-hearted demeanor by default. So it's interesting how you can be critical of someone but understand the very thing they're kind of good at is also contributing to maybe the thing we're also sort of critical of in another way. So it's just an interesting human nature in this way. I'm kind of entertained by these characters.